the amount of praise, and even as a journalist being there in the room, everything was incredibly smooth. We didn't have one hiccup. I know as Joe Burgers, we're going to be talking about, where are the plants and what we can get back to our complaints next week. But by and large, this was delivered so beautifully. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on whether you managed to sleep well last night and whether this is a moment for you to exhale. Welcome to the program, Zane.
Good morning, Iman. Yeah, sleep will take place tomorrow. we still got one more meeting today, which is sort of the related to the G20 that needs to take place. But I think you've reflected on the event and how it was managed. It was an enormous all-of-government approach to making sure that everything comes together to host this event. G20 events are really huge globally. You're bringing, leaders of, in our case, over 40, countries together, not just the G20 members, but, guest countries, international organizations. So we really wanted to make sure that the staging of the event is in line with the content of what we needed to deliver.
That is the most important thing, and I'm going to get into that content a little bit later on, Zane, because, so I asked ChatGPT, and we know we've got to be really careful using AI, but I put in the declaration document and looked for the Afrocentric resolutions that were taken from its perspective, and 21 were listed about being uniquely African, everything from the critical minerals framework to this new AI framework for Africa. And I'd love your thoughts on what some of the other experts are saying around, and analysts are saying, of this being a really Africanized G20 that, both in the spirit of hosting, which we did, but also just from a framework and systemic perspective, this was a G20 Summit declaration that had a lot in it for the African continent. Your thoughts on that?
So from the onset, we wanted to make sure that our themes have resonance for African economies, but also just for African people. So in every element of the negotiation, starting in December last year, in framing the themes and our priorities, we centered the African agenda. Also in our working groups, and remember the events of the last week really just is a culmination of a years-long meeting. The last 3 meetings took place this week, but you had over 140 meetings taking place through the course of the year. All of it focused on what would be required to ensure that African economies are unbounded from the restraints of debt, the work of the MDBs. Those are the kind of issues we really put on the agenda. In the negotiations themselves, we made sure that African issues are not relegated as ones that can be negotiated out. So that's why the negotiations were so long, whether it was on climate action, on AI, but debt sustainability and also sovereignty over natural resources was critical for us as well. So, it's Africa, but also the developing South that we thought should, be brought into this particular G20 with the perspective of working with others to implement them.
When we look at critical mineral sovereignty, it turned out to be a marquee conversation point for us at the weekend, because it really is an opportunity for the African continent, which is home to a large proportion of the minerals found in the world, and minerals which we need for the building of new types of technologies or EVs or cell phones, that we have this. And we have this critical minerals framework now that's been ratified and accepted at the G20. Zane, one of the criticisms is, of course, that this is all, well, first of all, it's new, but it's voluntary and non-binding. As we consider how Africa really begins to benefit and reap the harvest of the seeds that have been planted here, how important is it to, in terms of doubling down or reinforcing the integrity of the G20, ensure that these, even though they're non-voluntary, do come to fruition?
So none of the resolutions in the G20 are binding. The G20 is an informal grouping. But what we want to do is make sure that the weight of the G20 ensures a level of accountability in implementation. So while we say it's voluntary, we also know that we can hold our members to account for implementation, and we can also use the agreements to to sort of sharpen the debate on, you know, sovereignty of natural resources and critical minerals in other parts in the UN, but also in the IMF and the World Bank. So I do think that the fact that we got this critical minerals framework in place, whether it be voluntary, does lay the basis for a change in dialogue and financing and just trade relations around critical minerals. As you pointed out, you know, the critical minerals, which Africa has a huge resource.
Times called it a defiant move, a rejection of, and this is with regards as well to the closing, the bypassing of the traditional ceremony and affirmation of multilateralism. Le Monde says the U.S. boycott was an attempt to undermine South Africa's G20 presidency. South Africa pushed back and wasn't cowed. And you can find a number of headlines in this regard, which really hail South Africa's response in all of this. One of the words my colleague Simon Marks used this morning was the word dignity. That even in the face of this, we managed to pull off a muscularity that was important for us to set the tone, that we wouldn't be dictated to by the United States. I just want your perspective on how you think the rest of the world has viewed this, specifically from a leader's perspective, on how they have viewed South Africa's leadership in this particular saga.
So when we get a message from a state that, and a member state, an important member state that says that they choose not to participate, but at the same time send out a message that because they've chosen not to participate, there cannot be an outcome. So this was unusual territory for the G20. We spent a lot of time in the Sherpa meeting discussing what does consensus mean. And we also then positioned the fact that if we allow voluntary non-participation to lead to no outcomes, we're laying the basis for the weakening of the G20. But we then also didn't just confine that discussion to the G20. We extrapolated it into other multilateral spaces that where we allow for unilateral action to undermine collective decision-making, we are going to undermine all the institutions of global governance. So, initially there were a few delegations that felt that the US's non-participation and their message meant that we shouldn't have a declaration, that we shouldn't call this a G20 meeting. But in the discussions, we did shape an agreement that you can have consensus if there's consensus amongst those active in the meeting. We made the differentiation between voluntary non-participation and forced non-participation, where in other spaces where delegations are supposed to be there, but visa restrictions and other measures make it difficult for them to come, or there's other measures to prevent them from attending. These were all part of the discussions towards strengthening multilateralism, the rules of institutions. And that's why we could get the kind of agreement that we got, that not just the content, but the process and the strengthening of multilateralism that was championed, and leaders spoke out on that.
A quick 30-second close, Zane, before I let you go, on the gavel itself. So will a junior representative from South Africa handed over essentially this presidency to a junior representative from the US? What's it likely to look like, this next part?
Well, the agreement is that we should do it low-key. That's not, it's not just a South African issue. The US also doesn't want a very big handover event. So we will hand over at the level of a senior official from DIRCO to the US charge, and that will most likely take place tomorrow.
Oh, wow. And hopefully our cameras will be there. Zane Dangor, thank you very much for talking to us this